Ready for a deep dive? Today we're going medieval, but maybe not in the way you'd think. We're not focusing on the usual big names, like Aquinas or Augustine.
Right.
Instead, we're really digging into how medieval philosophers actually wrote philosophy. So get ready for a journey through, well, you could say a whole bunch of different forms. Allegories, disputations,
It's going to
summae.
be a bit of a surprise, how diverse, even playful their writing could be.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Not just dense treatises like you might imagine. So why should a modern philosopher care? He's someone deep in the current debates, using all the analytical tools we have today. Why look back at how medieval folks structured their arguments?
Well, because those forms, they offer us a kind of window into their philosophical world. How they approached big questions, really big questions. The nature of God, limits of human reason, the whole faith and knowledge relationship.
Yeah, still wrestling with those today, even if the approach has changed. So it's about getting into their methods, the assumptions, the framework, like the scaffolding they use to build their whole systems.
Precisely. And that, for a philosopher today, that's invaluable. It's how we engage with these thinkers on a deeper level, appreciate the nuances, and then maybe even see where their ideas resonate with what's going on right now.
Okay, let's unpack some of these forms, starting with, well, those allegories.
Yeah.
What were they using those for? And what are some, prime examples that come to mind?
Think about allegories as these philosophical journeys, but wrapped up in a really captivating story.
Okay.
One example would be Avicenna's treatise of the bird. It's this metaphor where a flock of birds, they're searching for the king, and that journey, that's the soul's ascent towards enlightenment.
Ah, I see.
And each stage, each challenge, they represent a level of understanding, the obstacles on that path to wisdom.
So it's not just a good story, but you're embedding philosophical concepts within that narrative structure.
Mm.
It makes it memorable, I guess.
Right. And it also allows for layers of interpretation, right?
Yeah.
So anybody can enjoy the surface story, but underneath, that's where you find the deeper philosophical truths that invite you to think more critically.
It's like a puzzle, a philosophical puzzle waiting to be unlocked.
Yeah.
And another great example, I think, is Ibn Tufil's Hey Ibn Yakan.
Absolutely. That's a classic. It tells the story of this boy raised by a gazelle on a deserted island.
Okay.
Alone, he discovers the truths of the universe just through observation and reason. And ultimately, he reaches this mystical understanding of the divine.
Wow, so it's about that power of human reason.
Yeah.
Even without any guidance, you can grasp these profound truths.
Exactly. And that was a huge theme in medieval philosophy.
Was it?
This tension between reason and revelation. It was central for them. And allegories like Hey Iminan gave them this way to explore it that was both intellectually stimulating but also aesthetically beautiful.
Yeah, they're really inviting the reader to come on that journey, right alongside the characters.
Exactly. And there's another crucial aspect to allegories, especially for thinkers, say, in tricky political or religious situations. They could kind of shield their more controversial views from censure, through allegory.
A form of coded communication then.
Exactly. So we need to think about that context when we analyze these allegories, the possibility that there are layers of meaning hidden beneath the surface.
Adds a whole nother dimension to interpreting them. But let's shift gears now from the richness of allegories to something more, concise aphorisms. What were they doing with those?
Aphorisms, not as common maybe as allegories, but still really potent tools. They're like philosophical sound bites, short, pithy statements, but packed with meaning. Think about Al-Farabi. His selected aphorisms, they give us these insights into, all sorts of things. Metaphysics, logic, ethics, even politics.
So they're distilling big ideas down to an essential form, almost like philosophical proverbs.
Exactly. And for a philosopher today, it's rewarding to grapple with those aphorisms. They make you unpack the layers, the context, the hidden assumptions.
It's like a mental workout, right? To think deeply about every single phrase.
Yeah, it is. And, there's some debate about whether Al-Farabi had a specific agenda with this form. Scholars think he was pulling a lot from the ancient Greeks, Plato and Aristotle, obviously. But he's presenting their ideas in this new light, filtered through his own lens.
So not just summarizing, but engaging, reworking, offering a fresh take.
Right. And some even argue that this aphoristic form, it might have been strategic for him. In the political climate he lived in, some views were risky to express openly.
So the aphorism as a way to hint at things without fully committing, leaving that room for interpretation.
Precisely. Ambiguity can be both intriguing and, sometimes necessary for survival.
Now, let's move to a form that seems made for philosophers, especially with that love of structure, logic, precision, axioms. What were they doing with these building blocks of knowledge?
Axioms, they're the foundation, the bedrock truths you build your whole system of knowledge on. And medieval philosophers, they were really influenced by the classics, like Euclid and Proclus. So those axioms played a huge role in shaping their whole philosophical framework.
It's about setting down those self-evident truths,
Right.
and then everything else follows logically from them.
Exactly. And it's not just logic, it's metaphysics too.
Oh.
These axioms, they were deeply connected to their understanding of reality, of God, the universe, the whole shebang.
So they're bridging the gap between logic and metaphysics then, to make this coherent system that includes both reason and belief.
That's a great way to put it. One prime example, Boethius's De Hebdomadibus. He lays out axioms about God and creation, trying to show how rational and coherent Christian doctrine really is.
It's like building a philosophical edifice, brick by logical brick. Each axiom is a foundation stone.
Exactly. And that axiomatic approach, its influence goes way beyond the Middle Ages. Think Leibniz, Descartes. They were all about secure foundations for knowledge, and they were indebted to that medieval tradition.
So it's a quest that's still alive today, finding those fundamental principles we can ground our understanding on.
Absolutely. It highlights how systems building, and never really goes away in philosophy. We want that framework, that system to grasp this huge complexity of human experience.
Now, onto a form that might seem a little more, tedious, maybe, commentaries, meticulously analyzing those authoritative texts. What was the purpose there?
Commentaries, they were fundamental to medieval intellectual life. Imagine, generations of scholars poring over texts like Aristotle, dissecting each argument, teasing out nuances, trying to reconcile anything that seems contradictory.
So it's not passive reading, it's active engagement, right?
Yeah.
Wrestling with the text, making sense of it all within this broader philosophical framework.
Exactly. And it's important to remember these weren't just summaries. They were platforms for original thought. Thinkers could develop their own ideas in dialogue with, the greats who came before them.
It's a conversation then,
Yeah.
across centuries, adding their own voice to that ongoing discourse.
And, there were different approaches. Some commentators focused on just the literal meaning. Others went deep into allegory or explored the wider philosophical implications.
So a range of strategies with their own strengths and weaknesses.
Right. And a big name here, Averroes. His commentaries on Aristotle, wow, they had a huge impact on Islamic and Christian thought. He was trying to harmonize Aristotle with Islamic theology. And that synthesis, it was super innovative, but also, pretty controversial.
He's building bridges then between philosophical and religious traditions, using the commentary as a tool for this cross-cultural dialogue.
Exactly. And it shows something else about commentaries. They weren't just about the past. They were about shaping the present, applying ancient wisdom to what was going on right then and there.
A form of philosophical time travel, you could say, bringing those voices from the past to address the challenges of their own time. Now let's look at a form that seems perfect for debate, dialogues. What made those so appealing to medieval thinkers?
Dialogues let them stage these philosophical debates in a really engaging way. Like in Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, he's having this conversation with Lady Philosophy herself. As he's grappling with questions of fate, free will, the nature of happiness.
Wow.
And it's so personal, moving, these deep themes framed within this drama between him, a prisoner, and the embodiment of wisdom.
So it's not abstract argument. It's giving those arguments a voice, a personality. You're watching the drama unfold.
And it's not always about arriving at the answer. A lot of times dialogues end with open questions, inviting the reader to keep that conversation going.
Stimulating thought, provoking more questions, engaging us in that quest for wisdom.
And they weren't limited to just philosophy, right? They also tackled theological issues, controversial or sensitive questions that might have been impossible to address in a straightforward treatise.
So a space for exploration, testing out ideas, pushing the boundaries of what's considered acceptable.
Exactly. And the form itself was so flexible. Some had these allegorical figures, others historical people, some mixed prose and poetry. It's a really rich tapestry of voices.
A literary playground for philosophical ideas.
That's a great way to put it. And for a philosopher today, analyzing these dialogues, it's not just about the content of the argument, you have to look at how they're using language, how the characters persuade, cajole, challenge each other.
A masterclass in rhetoric, then. The art of persuasion. how language shapes our understanding. Now let's go from the intimacy of dialogues to the more public arena of disputations. How did these shape medieval intellectual life?
Disputations, those were the formalized debates. Often in universities where students and masters would go head to head, sharpening their logic, really pushing the limits of knowledge. Imagine a packed hall, everyone's waiting as these two debaters go back and forth.
Like a philosophical showdown then? A battle of wits?
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And there were rules, procedures to make sure it was rigorous and fair. A question would be posed, usually something controversial, a real problem they were wrestling with. And the debaters would take sides, present their arguments, use evidence, logic, the whole thing.
So it's not just running. It's showing you've mastered the tools, building sound arguments, knowing how to refute your opponent.
Exactly. And the audience, they weren't just sitting there. They were listening critically, judging the arguments, sometimes even jumping into the debate.
A collective effort then, a community of thinkers pushing each other.
And the master, the one leading it, his role was crucial. He was like the referee, making sure everyone followed the rules, guiding the discussion, and then finally offering his own resolution to the question, the determinatio.
So it's not just about the clash. It's about that synthesis, reaching a deeper understanding through debate and analysis.
And that influence, it went beyond the universities. It shaped how they wrote philosophy, the structure of their arguments, how they anticipated objections, how they supported their claims.
So a legacy that lives on, that emphasis on clarity, rigor, and engaging with opposing views.
Right.
Now let's shift from that public arena to the more solitary forms, meditations and soliloquies. What drew them to these introspective forms of inquiry?
Meditations and soliloquies, they allowed these thinkers to explore, well, their own minds, to go deep into their consciousness, looking for truth and understanding, like Anselm and his proslogion. It's deeply personal, this prayerful meditation on God, almost like he's speaking directly to the divine.
It's like a philosophical diary then, recording their innermost thoughts, doubts, as they struggle with these big questions.
But it's more than just a private journal, They often have this universal quality, these themes that resonate with all of us. Like they're inviting us to join them on their journey, share in those moments of insight and struggle.
It's a guided meditation then through the complexities of thought.
Yeah, exactly. And these forms, they weren't just for Christian thinkers. Augustine's soliloquies, for example, they explore all sorts of questions. The nature of knowledge, the existence of God, the problem of evil. He does it through these introspective dialogues between himself and reason.
So even when they're alone, there's still this element of dialogue, of engaging with different parts of themselves to find truth.
Absolutely.
Now let's look at something really quintessentially medieval. Sentences, and those sentences commentaries. What were those all about and why were they so important?
Sentences, they were collections of these authoritative statements, excerpts from scripture, the church fathers, other revered sources. Imagine like a treasure chest of wisdom.
So distilling tradition, making this compendium of essential knowledge.
Precisely. And the commentaries, that's where things get really interesting. Generations of scholars analyzing those sentences, exploring their meaning, debating their implications.
It's like a collective intellectual project working together to unpack the wisdom of the past and apply it to their own time.
Right. And of course, the most famous example, Peter Lombard's Sentences, this huge collection of theological statements. It became the foundation of theological education in the 13th century.
So like a training manual, guiding them through Christian doctrine, teaching them how to analyze and debate.
And remember, these commentaries weren't just about memorizing things. They were sites of debate, where commentators argued, offered alternative readings, pushed the boundaries.
Dynamic, evolving, each generation adding to the conversation.
And for a philosopher today, studying them, it's like watching the evolution of ideas, how these concepts were debated, refined, reinterpreted over time, a philosophical tapestry being woven thread by thread.
Okay, now let's venture into an area that might seem familiar to, modern logicians. Sophismata, insolubilia, obligations. What were they doing with these puzzles and paradoxes?
They were exploring those outer limits of logic, those tricky philosophical knots, like medieval brain teasers, to challenge our assumptions.
So playing with language, testing its limits, seeing how it refers to the world in these strange ways.
Exactly. Sophismata were these propositions, ambiguous ones. You could argue them both ways, true and false. Shows how slippery meaning can be.
So it's a game, but with language.
And then insolubilia, even more mind-bending. Self-referential paradoxes, like that liar's paradox, everything I say is false. These really challenged the foundation of logic, making you confront the limits of language, the possibility that something can be true and false.
Staring into the abyss of incoherence, trying to make sense of statements that break all the rules.
And obligations, those are these formalized games, where you'd try to trap your opponent in a contradiction, forcing them to accept these problematic premises.
A philosophical chess match.
These games, they might seem like just curiosities, but they were actually really important for developing medieval logic and semantics.
Makes sense. When you're grappling with those puzzles, you have to get super precise with language.
Exactly. And it's a good reminder that even the most abstract philosophical explorations, they can have real-world consequences. Look how they influence the development of logic, even math and computer science.
Wow. Now, for the grand finale of our tour, the Summa. What made this form so ambitious, so prominent in medieval intellectual life?
The Summa aimed to be the ultimate treatment of an entire field, a grand synthesis of all the key questions, arguments, insights, the whole thing. Think, the ultimate philosophical encyclopedia.
It's a huge undertaking, right? Bringing order and coherence to all of human knowledge.
Exactly. And most famous, of course, Aquinas' Summa Theologiae, this monumental achievement trying to synthesize all of Christian theology within this logical framework.
It's a cathedral of thought, every argument precisely placed in this grand design.
Yeah, a great analogy. Aquinas divided his Summa into 3 parts, each one tackling a fundamental aspect. And within each part, he addresses all these questions, using a condensed version of that disputation structure.
Like he's leading us on a tour, step by step, through Christian doctrine.
Right. And the Summa, it wasn't just answers. It was an invitation to think, to wrestle with the hard questions, and be part of that quest for truth.
So he's giving us the tools then to build our own understanding.
Exactly. And its impact was huge. It became the model for organizing knowledge in all sorts of areas, not just philosophy, but theology, even law.
So a legacy that still shapes how we organize knowledge, this desire for comprehensive understanding. Now, before we wrap up this look at forms, we need to talk about authorities, this vast sea of knowledge they inherited. How do they navigate it all and engage with those voices from the past?
Medieval philosophers, they weren't writing in a vacuum. They were deeply engaged with tradition, all those revered texts and thinkers. And citing those authorities, it wasn't just a formality. It was showing your knowledge, grounding your arguments, being part of the conversation.
Right, they were adding their own threads to this intellectual tapestry that stretched back centuries.
Yeah.
But what happens when those authorities disagreed? Or when they clashed with the author's own ideas?
That's where their skills at harmonization came in. They were amazing at reconciling those seemingly different viewpoints.
Okay.
They'd interpret texts so carefully, putting them in new contexts, emphasizing certain passages over others, sometimes even subtly reinterpreting key terms just to create the sense of coherence.
It's like a philosophical puzzle, isn't it? Trying to make all the pieces fit.
Exactly. And they had some guiding principles for doing this. One big one was the idea of concordance, this belief that all the true authorities, ultimately they aimed at the same truth, even if they expressed it differently.
So the commentator's job was to uncover that underlying unity to show how those contradictions could be resolved.
Right. It took deep understanding of the texts, the historical context, the nuances of their language. For a philosopher today studying those strategies, it's like watching a master chess player anticipating moves, thinking steps ahead, finding creative solutions.
Now, Scripture, that wasn't just any text, right? They had this whole other level of authority.
Absolutely. Scripture carried moral and spiritual weight that set it apart. So when medieval thinkers cited it, it wasn't just proof texting, grabbing a verse to support their claim. It was about connecting their reasoning to a deeper purpose, to the ultimate source of truth.
So they're bringing faith and reason into dialogue, using Scripture to illuminate those philosophical questions.
And for us today, understanding how they did that is key to grasping their whole philosophical project. It's not about imposing our modern distinctions. It's about appreciating how intertwined those two realms were for them.
Now, we can't talk about medieval philosophy without talking about esotericism. The idea that some writers hid their true views maybe because they were afraid or to protect people from dangerous knowledge. Or how does that play out in their writing?
Esotericism, it's a complex issue, especially with medieval thought scholars debate how much it was a deliberate strategy, especially for thinkers in those restrictive environments.
So we're reading between the lines then, looking for those hidden meanings, the codes, the subtle hints.
Yeah, and it's tricky. We have to be careful not to project our own ideas onto the texts. But at the same time, we can't ignore the context, the fact that some might have had to hide their views to avoid censorship or even persecution.
It adds a layer of mystery, but also a responsibility to be sensitive to what they were up against.
For a philosopher today, engaging with those questions of esotericism, it's like being an intellectual detective. It takes careful analysis, understanding the context, and being open to different interpretations.
Now, surely not everyone just went along with the established authorities and doctrines, right? Were there any philosophical rebels in the Middle Ages, people who challenged the status quo?
Of course, medieval philosophy wasn't some monolithic block. It was dynamic, always evolving, full of debate, different voices, bold thinkers pushing the boundaries.
So even with censorship looming, there were still those who questioned authority, challenged dogma.
Absolutely. Think about Peter Abelard. His theological views caused such a stir, he was condemned. And then the thinkers targeted by the condemnation of 1277, that was a huge attempt to control philosophical speculation that they thought was too radical or dangerous.
Wow. A reminder that intellectual freedom comes at a price. But those dissenting voices, they show how vibrant medieval thought really was.
Exactly. And studying those moments of dissent that's so illuminating for us today, we see how ideas were debated, how those boundaries were drawn and redrawn, how philosophical inquiry itself was constantly being negotiated.
Now, how did they engage with those that they disagreed with? Was it more, polite back then?
That's interesting. Early on, it was actually bad form to directly name your opponents in critiques.
Really?
So there was this subtle dance of veiled references, allusions, carefully worded rebuttals. You had to figure out who they were talking about.
It sounds almost like a game trying to refute someone without naming them.
Exactly. It took real skill. But by the late 13th, 14th centuries, things started to shift. Philosophers like John Duns Scotus and Peter Oriol, they began citing their rivals more openly. It became more direct and historically grounded.
So a move towards transparency.
You could say that it reflects this growing awareness of how ideas develop historically, recognizing that everyone's part of a lineage and that engaging with those who came before is essential.
It's fascinating how those forms of argumentation evolved alongside the ideas themselves, looking back across all these styles, the allegories, the disputations, the summi. It seems like medieval philosophers were more than just thinkers. They were masterful communicators.
Absolutely. They understood that how you express an idea is just as important as the idea itself. And they used language not just to convey information, but as a creative force shaping their world through the forms and strategies they chose.
So we're not just exploring the history of ideas, we're exploring the history of how they communicated those ideas, how they engage with each other, and with those big questions. And that's invaluable for us today.
Right. It helps us understand the nuances, the context, and the lasting power of what they contributed.
Now let's turn to another fascinating aspect. The different forms of systematic thought that emerged during this period. We've talked about the grandeur of the summa, but there were other approaches to systematization that deserve attention.
You're right. While the Summa aimed for completeness, other forms like sentences, commentaries, and even some types of questions collections, they offered more focused but still systematic explorations of key issues, and these forms were really important for shaping how knowledge was organized and transmitted in the universities.
So it's like they were creating different kinds of intellectual maps, each one serving a different purpose. The Summa might be the big picture overview, while these others offer more detailed guides to specific areas.
That's a great analogy, for instance. Sentences, commentaries like those on Peter Lombard's work, they often delved systematically into specific doctrines or disputes. It's like a deep dive into a particular topic, analyzing every angle and using a range of authorities to build a coherent understanding.
Makes sense. It's like taking a core concept and unpacking it layer by layer, looking at its history, its implications, its connections to other ideas, and all of that within a structured framework.
Precisely. And for a philosopher today, studying these commentaries can be so rewarding. You see how they meticulously broke down concepts, made those subtle distinctions, and built these intricate arguments, all within a framework that aimed for both clarity and comprehensiveness.
Like watching a master craftsman at work.
Exactly. And what about questions, collections? How did those contribute?
Yeah, good point.
Questions, collections, especially those organized by theme, they presented a structured approach to exploring a range of problems. So while individual questions might focus on resolving a specific puzzle when you put them together, they could offer a systematic exploration of a bigger topic, like the nature of the soul, the problem of evil, or the relationship between faith and reason.
It's like assembling a mosaic. Each question is a piece, and by arranging them thoughtfully, you create this coherent picture of a complex issue.
That's a great way to put it, and this form was perfect for teaching. Imagine a master leading a student through a carefully chosen set of questions, each one designed to highlight a different facet of a larger problem, so the students wouldn't just learn doctrines or arguments, they'd develop critical thinking skills and learn how to debate.
It's learning by actively grappling with the questions instead of just passively absorbing information. That's an approach we can still learn from.
Absolutely. And for a modern philosopher studying these collections, it's like a crash course in medieval thought. You see them wrestling with those fundamental problems, dissecting arguments, and coming up with solutions all within this framework that's both rigorous and accessible.
It's like being transported back to those medieval universities experiencing that intellectual energy firsthand.
Exactly. And this brings us to something else that's often overlooked, the playful and even humorous side of medieval philosophy.
Really, we tend to think of it as so serious and formal.
I know, right? But they weren't afraid to be witty, to use wordplay. You find it everywhere, from puns and metaphors to imaginative thought experiments and even the occasional jab at an opponent, even in those serious theological debates. There's a flash of humor, a moment of levity that breaks the tension and reminds us that they were human beings too.
So a reminder that even the most serious topics can benefit from a little humor.
Exactly. And recognizing those moments, it enriches our understanding. It helps us see them not just as minds, but as people who could appreciate wit and creativity, who could find joy even in the midst of these complex debates.
Now, speaking of intellectual playfulness, let's turn to something that sounds like a medieval version of philosophical game night. Sophismata, insolubilia, and obligation stiff. We've touched on these, but I'd love to go deeper. Why were they so fascinated by these puzzles?
They were like an intellectual playground, a space to experiment with language, to test logic and see what happens when you play with self-referential statements and paradoxes. They were pushing the boundaries, venturing into those strange spaces where our normal ideas about truth break down.
A boot camp for the mind, then.
Exactly. Sophismata were those ambiguous propositions that could be both true and false. They show how tricky language can be, and they forced thinkers to really pay attention to subtleties of meaning, context interpretation, to see how even simple statements could be more complicated than they seem.
It's like meaning is hiding, waiting to surprise us.
Right? In Solubilia, those went even further into these self-referential paradoxes, like the liar's paradox. Everything I say is false. These statements, they twist language into knots. They challenge logic itself, making you confront the possibility of contradiction.
That's like trying to make sense of something that breaks all the rules.
And obligations, those were more formalized games where you try to trap your opponent in a contradiction by making them accept a series of problematic premises, like a verbal chess match.
Sounds like a great way to train your mind to think logically, to build arguments, anticipate objections.
Exactly. And these games, they weren't just for fun. They actually play a role in developing medieval logic and semantics. By working through these puzzles, they had to get more precise with definitions, clarify the rules of logic, and explore all those complexities of self-reference.
So they're using these games as tools.
Right. It's a reminder that even the most abstract exploration can have real consequences. They influence logic, math, computer science, even how we think and reason today.
Now, before we move on, I want to go back to authorities. We talked about how they cited them, harmonized their views, even challenged them. But I'm curious about how that engagement changed over time. What were some of the key debates surrounding authorities?
That's a great question. The role of authorities was always shifting early on. There was a huge emphasis on respecting the wisdom of the past figures like Aristotle, Augustine. The Church Fathers, citing them wasn't just a convention, it was grounding your arguments in a bedrock of knowledge.
Standing on the shoulders of giants.
Exactly. But as the medieval world changed, especially with universities and the rediscovery of lost texts, people started taking a more critical approach. They recognized that even the greatest minds could make mistakes, that their views might need reinterpreting, or that seemingly opposing views could be reconciled.
So it became more about engaging with the ideas, not just blindly accepting them.
Right, and this went hand in hand with a growing awareness of the history of ideas, thinkers like Bonaventure and Aquinas. They started tracing how concepts evolved, how earlier thinkers contributed to the conversation, and how their views were shaped by their own times.
It's like building a family tree of ideas.
Exactly, and this historical awareness led to more sophisticated interpretations. They realized that understanding an author's intent meant understanding not just the words, but the context, the debates they were part of, their rhetorical strategies.
So a much deeper approach to reading and interpretation.
And this led to some big debates like the relationship between faith and reason, Some argued that reason should be subordinate to faith, while others thought reason could lead us to truths about God independently.
It's not just about what they said, but how we understand it today.
Exactly. And for us as philosophers, engaging with these debates about authority is really important. It makes us examine our own assumptions about knowledge tradition and the role of the past in our search for truth.
Now, before we get to our final thoughts, let's talk about censorship. Yeah. We've mentioned it, but I'd like to dig into the dynamics of intellectual control and how thinkers navigated those tricky waters of orthodoxy.
Censorship was a huge issue shaped by religion, politics, and institutions. The church, as the guardian of orthodoxy, had a lot of power over ideas, especially those they considered heretical or dangerous, and universities had their own ways of making sure teaching and scholarship stayed within the lines.
So it was a risky business expressing your ideas.
They had to be strategic, sometimes subtle, sometimes bolder. One approach was to frame their arguments carefully, using language that wouldn't upset the censors. They might be ambiguous, rely on established authorities, or present their ideas as hypotheticals.
Trying to fly under the radar.
Exactly, and sometimes they would even censor themselves, deleting passages, revising arguments, or staying silent on certain topics. The fear of being condemned in prison or exiled was very real.
It makes you wonder how many great ideas were lost because of that fear.
It does, but we also see those who challenged the limits risked everything for truth. Think of Roger Bacon, who supported empirical observation and scientific experimentation, even though it went against the grain, or Marguerite Porete, whose mystical writings got her labeled a heretic and burned at the stake.
It's inspiring to see that courage, that willingness to stand up for their beliefs.
It is, and for a philosopher today, studying these stories of censorship and dissent is so important. It helps us understand the power dynamics, how knowledge was controlled, and how thinkers found ways to navigate those dangerous landscapes.
Now, as we wrap up our exploration, I want to think about the bigger picture. What can we as modern philosophers learn from these medieval masters of language and argument? What insights can they offer us?
They offer so much. They remind us that philosophy isn't just abstract theories. It's a living tradition of inquiry, debate, and expression. They were masters of language, using it with precision and artistry to explore those big questions. And they understood that form and content go hand in hand, that how you say something matters just as much as what you say.
It's about finding the right form for your ideas.
Exactly. And they knew how to argue, how to build a case, anticipate objections, and use language to persuade, challenge, and inspire. By studying their work, we can learn from them, sharpen our own skills, and become better communicators.
It's like they're giving us a master class in philosophical writing, and those lessons are timeless.
And they can also help us think more creatively and critically about philosophy itself. They were always pushing those boundaries, experimenting with different approaches, exploring the limits of language, and finding new ways to organize knowledge. They remind us that philosophy isn't static. It's a dynamic process of exploration and discovery.
They were pioneers forging new paths.
Exactly. And they challenge us to think differently, to question our assumptions, and to be open to new approaches.
So as we say goodbye to our medieval guides, let's remember their love of language, their commitment to rigorous argument, and their dedication to the pursuit of truth.
And let's keep exploring, questioning, and engaging in thoughtful dialogue, striving to make our own contributions to this incredible tradition of philosophical thought.
It's been quite a journey, hasn't it? Through all these medieval philosophical forms. And what's striking is they weren't just, these abstract thinkers. They were wordsmiths, storytellers, debaters, really using language to wrestle with these huge questions.
Yeah.
And they were so versatile, moving between allegories, disputations, commentaries, summary. Each one had its own way of illuminating their thought.
Absolutely. That versatility shows how well they understood the power of language,
Right.
How different forms serve different philosophical purposes. Sometimes you need that broad sweep of an allegory to really convey a journey. Other times it's the precision of logic to dissect a problem. And sometimes you need that synthetic power of a summa to bring it all together.
It's like they had this whole toolkit of intellectual instruments, and they knew exactly which one to use, wielding language with both precision and artistry. So, as we wrap up, let's go back to that question we started with. Why should a modern philosopher, someone like us today, care about this? Why does it matter how they structured their thinking?
Well, I think there are a few reasons why engaging with these forms can be so valuable. First, it just gives us a much richer understanding of the history of philosophy itself. You see a diversity of thought that's often missed in the usual accounts. You go beyond the big names and you see all these other thinkers having these sophisticated conversations, pushing the boundaries.
It's like uncovering this hidden chapter, right?
Exactly. And second, studying these forms can actually make us better philosophers, better writers. They were masters of argumentation, of writing clearly, anticipating objections, using language strategically. We can learn so much from them.
It's like having them as our writing coaches across the centuries.
Well, that's a great way to put it. And those lessons, they're timeless. They work just as well today. And third, I think it helps us think more creatively and critically about philosophy itself, as a process. These thinkers were always pushing limits, experimenting, exploring the limits of what language can do, finding new ways to organize knowledge.
It reminds us that philosophy isn't static. It's dynamic. It's evolving.
Exactly. They were pioneers. And they challenge us to think outside the box, to question everything, to be open to new approaches.
So as we say goodbye to these medieval thinkers, let's hold on to their spirit, that love of language, that commitment to rigorous argument, that dedication to finding the truth.
Absolutely. Let's keep exploring, keep questioning, keep that dialogue going, trying to add our own voices to that tapestry of thought that they helped create.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring.